purposes. I'm just saying from the developmental perspective, that's what. Now, looking at things from the point of view of the id, what is emotion? See, the id is really volition, the volitional self, a self that seeks, that has a will, that has a point of view, that seeks to preserve itself, that seeks to propagate itself. Emotion is merely the arm of volition that provides the flavoring to perception. So my volitional self wants to eat an apple. And I experience desire. The emotion of desire is merely the expression of my volition when I see an apple. And so emotion is actually an arm of volition, It is the arm that provides flavor to perception. Because the eye does not see in the same way that a camera does. The camera takes in all of the frequencies of light that are there in this room. But the eye is not the same, because the eye is ruled by volition. So if I'm hungry, it looks first at where the food is. If I'm thirsty, it first looks at where the bottle of water is, to the exclusion of everything else. If I see a friend or see somebody that I know, I light up and I walk towards that person, because the emotion that is caused by seeing a known face, helps me behave in a different way. The camera is not the same as an eye. The eye is. So the emotion is something that is evaluative. It helps us evaluate and discern between different stimuli. It is also ubiquitous, meaning that all mental processes in the mind, all mental processes have an emotional framework which we're not aware of. But actually, only when emotion rises to the level of consciousness, we call it feelings, but it's there. And I will prove it to you. I will prove to you that emotion is largely unconscious and that it is ubiquitous. Let us take the phenomenon of déjà vu. What is déjà vu? Anyone? Yes. Exactly. So you see something, intellectually you know that you're experiencing it for the first time, and yet it has a familiar feel. You go to a completely new place. Let's say I have never been to, let us say, for example, I have never been to Khajuraho, the temple. So I go to the temple at Khajuraho, and I have this feeling of familiarity as if I've been there before. That is déjà vu. Why does it happen? There is an emotional correlate to when we are in a familiar surrounding. Like when you go home at the end of this lecture, you put your feet up, you relax, you have a cup of coffee, you talk to the family, you're there in your own living room. There is an emotional correlate, which is, there is an emotional correlate to being in a strange environment, a new environment, which is linked to curiosity, which is linked to increased arousal, because we're scanning the environment much more avidly when we're in a new environment. Now, when there is a brain switch, and we go into a new place, and instead of the emotional correlate of being in a new place, when we experience the emotion of familiarity, what happens is we don't say, I'm in a new place, but I'm experiencing the emotion of familiarity, because we don't know that there is an emotion of familiarity. It's unconscious. We don't have a name for it. It's not a feeling. What we say is, oh, I've been here before. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah? Let's take Capgras syndrome. What is Capgras syndrome? Everyone here knows what Capgras syndrome is. Capgras syndrome is, you have this phenomenon in some people who are brain damaged, where they're not able to, it's a form of prosopagnosia, they're not able to recognize their loved ones. They're not able to recognize their loved ones. What happens is that they see the loved one, but they say this is, so they see the husband and they say, it looks like my husband, but it's not my husband. Why would they say that? The poor husband is there, and the wife says, this is not my husband. Because although she can perceive that the husband is there, the husband feeling is not there, because the connection between the visual cortex and the limbic brain is damaged. And so she's not able to get the correlate of emotion to the experience, and therefore she says, so it is emotion that we use to evaluate, not perception. What evaluates is the emotional correlate of what we perceive, Emotion is ubiquitous, although we don't know it. It happens to all experiences. There is an emotional correlate to all experiences, and it's largely unconscious. That's the point I wanted to make. And so this is the second last slide. What we have done is cognition is there to serve volition. It is there to serve the id. All of our cognitive processes are so that we can better serve the needs of the id. And then to help our cognition better, we've developed computers, which is a cognitive system that actually has no volitional spark. The most complex computer in the world, if you have this room that is full of a processing system, a supercomputer, it is a fantastic cognitive apparatus. It does not have a volitional spark. And yet, the simplest, if you take a unicellular organism, an amoeba, and you put a drop of food, a plankton, next to it, with its pseudopodia, it will move to the plankton. If you put a drop of acid, it will move away. It has hardly any cognition. It has a volitional. It is wholly volitional. It's wholly id. What we have done is we have set up a cognitive system like a computer, and then we're using that computer to try and explain qualia and to try and explain consciousness. We never can, because it has no self. It has no volition. It has no id. Unless we start with explaining the neurophysiology, the neurobiology of volition and emotion, we cannot explain qualitative subjective experience. We cannot explain sentience, much less self-consciousness. That is the fundamental theory that I wanted to put forward to you. Thank you very much.
Full exposition of cognition. If the clock ran a little slower, probably it could have gone on and on. We have to go by the time. So I next invite Dr. Vasudevan to speak on the neurology of spirituality. Dr. Vasudevan.
Wonderful talk on consciousness and the self. We are there, sort of digressing and diverting away from that to a slightly different aspect, but in the same direction, about neurology and spirituality. So in going through this, I tried to first understand myself, a few of these terms. So I put it forward to you as I found it. So first of these is, we all know what is neurology, so I don't think I have to give you a definition of neurology. So next term in that was spirituality. So spirituality is described by the Oxford Dictionary as a vital life principle which integrates other aspects of the person and is an essential ingredient in interpersonal relationships and bonding. A lot of words, but to tell you frankly, I didn't really understand what this means. So that is Oxford Dictionary for you. So then I thought maybe I should look a little deeper, a different place. And then I looked this up. In searching for this, I found this so-called definition of spirituality, which is supposed to be more practical in its approach. It says that spirituality is the search for the source of everything. Or it is alternatively described as the inner path to find one's unique essence, or possibly a passageway to the perfection within us. Or it's another way to bring us together in one thought. Well, probably, it makes it a little less nebulous, but still we are nowhere near the so-called source. So I still didn't understand what this means. So then I thought, let me look further. And then, in reality, what we find is that there is in talking to people or when you read, you find that there is very little differentiation between religion and spirituality. For a lot of people, when we say spirituality, it automatically means religion. Without naming any particular religion, it means religion. So, or religious practices or rituals means spirituality for a lot of people. So, the most common definition is religion or spirituality means what I understand it to mean. Or spirituality means what I understand it to mean. Or my approach to religion or spirituality plus other religions or spiritualities as interpreted through my understanding. So there is always self-focused or self-directed understanding to this process. And as you will find that each person's experience in this is very unique, and each person will have his own definition of what he calls religious or spiritual, and therefore it is very difficult to put a particular scientific definition on this particular term. It's very difficult to nail it down. So I left it at that. I said, okay, so fine, then let us see what else can we do about this in looking for spirituality. So I thought maybe we should look at the practical side and see what are the things that one does which may make a person spiritual. So fine, what are spiritual practices? Prayer is always first on the list in any search that you do on spiritual practices. Prayer is the first. It may be any form of prayer to any god that you choose. Chanting. This is the list that I found. Meditation. Study of the science of spirituality. We can go through that later. This doesn't mean much to me now. Sacrifice. Again, a rather abstract word with a lot of meanings to different people. Spiritual love, which means what they mean by that is something which is unbounded or probably without any expectations. That's what it means. And further on, service unto truth or company of the truth, removing personality defects or deficits rather, reducing the ego, performing yoga. Don't laugh at this. This is what I found actually. So it goes from one extreme to the other. Dialogue between different people and social or community service. If you look at these groups, two groups, what you find, the first slide of spiritual practices, they are all, they'll probably fall under the category of what you could term as religious, meaning prayer, chanting, meditation, sacrifice, and so on. Whereas the second set are the ones which are not really religious in that sense of the word. It's more secular in the sense that you need not be bound to any particular line of thought for you to be spiritual. For example, you can do yoga without being really religious, or you can reduce your ego without being religious or conforming to any particular faith. Dialogue can be had by anybody, a decent dialogue. Social or community service, selfless service to people definitely falls into this category. So there are these groups of practices which are labeled spiritual for probably our day-to-day use. As you can see from all this, these so-called definitions and the practices, when we come to really understanding the term spirituality, there is a language breakdown. What one person tries to communicate, the person sitting across may not understand. What I am trying to say may come across to you as something entirely different, which you are seeing through the color of your eye or through your perspective. So, like I said, the perspective and the understanding in this changes. And to add sort of confusion to the picture, there are a lot of new terminologies. As I said, there is a very fine dividing line between religion and spirituality as such already, but to make it probably more confusing, new terms are coming up. SBNR, this is very popular now in the Western countries, spiritual but not religious. People are rather fond of calling themselves SBNR. They are spiritual but not religious. So they may do many of these things which you saw on the second set of slides, maybe. We don't know, but they can call themselves spiritual. Or they call themselves spiritually independent. So based on what? Based on a deep search for meaning of life or the truth or personal ethics and so on. So these are various new terminologies. As we can see, one need not be religious or conform to any particular faith to be spiritual as per definition. So that is only so far as I could go in my search for definition of what we could call spirituality and whether we could confine it within any scientific box. It's absolutely impossible under the current situation. So spirituality does not lend itself to any kind of scientific definition, but that does not mean, I must hasten to add, that it does not lend itself to scientific experimentation. Pardon?
Can I interpret during the talk?
Yeah, please.
What is the aim of spirituality?
Yeah, so we will come to that. So my idea of putting this up was to look at it from the neurological perspective, to give it a scientific perspective. Like I said, what is the purpose of spirituality? To attain the truth, to attain more peace in life, or to be joyous or blissful, to shed your negative emotions, and so on and so forth. That is so-called define, the purpose or the aim of being spiritual in life. So when we look at it through the lens of science, we find that spirituality fails the rigor of all scientific principles. It does not lend itself to definition in the first place. So how does it lend itself to any further approach? So the science or scientific approach has always classically been reductionistic and materialistic. In the sense, science has no place in it for faith or belief. You have to prove it, then science will accept it. And in that sense, it always believes, or it always places importance. I can't say belief. It always places importance on the cause and effect principle. If there is an effect, there has to be a cause. Or if there is a cause, it has to produce the expected effect. And this has to be replicable. Always. The same cause should produce the same effect again and again, irrespective of the situation in which it may be found. And the effect or whatever conclusion has always got to be logical, and it should be beyond reasonable doubt. These are the criteria of science for anything and everything which falls under the ambit of science. As such, you can say science per se, pure science, is atheistic. There is no place in science for God. There is no belief. There is no place for belief in science. But things are now somewhat changing in the sense, like you said, in the definition of consciousness or self. When quantum physics starts playing a role, physicists tend to accept the findings of quantum physics. For example, one of the things that is said in quantum physics is that they ask you on faith to accept that a photon is a virtual particle. They tell you, the physicists tell you, that we believe that the photon is a virtual particle. When two photons cross each other, they clash. If it were two electrons, they will go in different directions. But when there are two photons, that is particles of light crossing each other, they will cross each other, they will clash, and then they will go exactly in the same directions that they were intended to go earlier. Now, how does physics explain this? They say, no, we can't. The scientists say glibly, no, we can't explain this, but this is what happens, so we believe it. So when they say believe that, then they should also put a step forward and try to believe some of the other things which we are trying to look at here. So therefore, for all these reasons in the past, spirituality, mysticism, religion has been confined to the dustbin, and they have been receding into unpopularity for probably all the wrong reasons. Like I said, science needs proof, but always one thing that we forget in science and physics or chemistry or biology or whatever is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. When you say that I can't find this, it does not mean it is not there. It is there. Probably we are not seeing it properly. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The second important thing where science fails is observation is not equal to interpretation. The same observation will lend itself to multiple interpretations. Currently, science is at a level, scientific interpretation of certain facts or findings are at a level where we can't go beyond that to explain things like consciousness or even this abstract term like spirituality. So that's where we are now. But spirituality or the behavior of man or a human being, as we define in terms of behavior, in terms of what we find when they practice these spiritual methods, is that there is a change in their behavior. There is a change in the behavior pattern in terms of emotions, in terms of their approach, in terms of their experiences of life, in terms of their functioning within a community. All these things change. So obviously, it has got to do with the mind of the person, and therefore the brain of the person. Therefore, we feel that probably neurology is now uniquely poised to study the science behind all this of spirituality. So therefore, I thought I should talk about this today. And again, neurology is no stranger to this field at all. A lot of names, right from maybe 150 years ago. The first person here is Sir Charles Sherrington. We all know the reflex which Sherrington first described. He was a deeply spiritual person in his own terms, not mine. Gray Walter, another pioneer, especially with robotics, artificial intelligence, and the concept of consciousness and self. He was a neurologist as well as an engineer, and he contributed a lot to this field. And of course, Wilder Penfield, at one time he was dubbed the most famous Canadian to ever live. He was one of the most famous neurosurgeons and neurologists from Canada, a pioneer in establishment of the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he has done a lot of work in the field of so many things in neurology, and not only that, but in this direction as well. And incidentally, Sir Charles Sherrington and Wilder Penfield firmly believed that consciousness is beyond the brain. Consciousness is something which cannot be explained on the basis of brain activity alone. So that's why I put those names up. But more important than all this, Jean-Martin Charcot from 1825 to 1893, who is considered the father of modern neurology, he also did his bit. He contributed a lot to this field. In fact, there is a very funny anecdote about him. He used to experiment on himself in a lot of things, scientifically. So he was very interested, and he genuinely wanted to know about these trance-like states and the feeling of joy and bliss which some of these patients, so at those times they were called insane. All this was dubbed insane, and these patients used to come to that. At that time, there was no bifurcation between neurology and psychiatry. So the same physicians used to deal with neurology, and it was well with him. But the point here is that even at that time, people like Charcot were very interested in this, but at that time it was not given a very robust scientific meaning, or they were doing it on an individual level rather than at a concerted level. So going beyond that, a lot of work has been done in the last 20 to 30 years in this field, especially in terms of research on the brain in spiritual people, the people who practice meditation, chanting, prayer, and so on. These are the groups on which a lot of studies have been done. I'll cut a long story short and come right to the point. And this is for some of our non-neurological friends and colleagues who are here. These are the neural substrates, rather the parts of the brain which are now believed to be highly important or active in people. I know it keeps escaping. I keep calling them patients. They're not patients, in subjects or people who are spiritual. So the part which are most important are the hypothalamus, which is deep inside the brain. I will show you next picture. The hippocampus, the anterior cingulate gyrus, the prefrontal area, which is part of the frontal lobe of the anterior part of the brain, the orbitofrontal area, the amygdala, thalamus, striatum, precuneus, which is part of the parietal lobe, which plays a very important role, and the posterior superior parietal lobule. So these are certain parts of the brain which play a very crucial role, and they form circuits within these areas which are strengthened during such practices. This picture shows some of these areas here again. You can see them there. Is there a pointer here? So that is the precuneus, which is part of the parietal lobe. This is the inner part of the brain, the medial part. And these are the areas which we describe, like the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and so on. So the interesting aspect here is that these areas which we just made a list of are the same areas which are highly important for emotion, for the expression of emotion. So when a person expresses emotion and you do a scan on that person, the same areas will light up as when a person is doing some kind of spiritual practice. So that is very important, we have found. So scientific studies which have been done, what have they been done on? They have been done on subjects who have performed various spiritual practices. The most common are those on meditators, various types of meditation. The commonest, the favorite in those groups are the Tibetan type of meditation, or so-called Vipassana type of Buddhist type of meditations, and on prayer, that is chanting. Carmelite nuns who sort of are experts at praying for long stretches, hours together, on prayer, on chanting, even on kirtan kriya, the Sikh form of meditation, which they continue to repeat 4 syllables, sa, ta, na, ma, and they keep repeating the same syllables again and again. Even studies, including fMRIs, have been done on subjects who have been doing this. On glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, which is extremely rare. There are only a very small group of people in North America who do this glossolalia, that is different tongues, that is in Latin. The language is more or less not understandable to us at all, but there are certain people who are proficient in reciting these poems or whatever they are, prayers in certain tongues, and that is called glossolalia, speaking in tongues. So these kind of practices, people who have been doing this kind of practices, these studies have been done on them. Most of these studies in the initial stages were psychological, to find out how their behavior changed, what happened to them in society and so on, how they functioned, and what they described personally. But of late, with the advent of more and more tools which are available to us in the form of PET and fMRI, we are now actually able to see areas of the brain which are active in these practices, paranormal events and so on. So this just gives you an idea of what actually happens in these subjects. Images, that is comparison of baseline to prayer. These are prayer scans from those nuns which I mentioned. As you can see on the left hand side, the left hand frame shows you before and after. And that's before and that is after. So you see this language area here, when they are praying, obviously it lights up, and other areas which are involved in input or receiving input from the rest of the body, they become dark. The front portions of the brain, in which a lot of concentration takes place, that is the frontal lobes, they light up very significantly. And the posterior aspect, that is the parietal area, which receives sensory input from the body during deep meditation, gets blocked. As you see, it becomes yellow. So there is hardly any activity in these areas. So that is in essence what happens. You just bear this in mind as we go on. So you'll realize the significance of this. So I will just summarize the common findings in many of these studies. Subject, they can be divided into two groups, the subjective findings and the objective ones. Subjective, they almost invariably, almost uniformly, all the people who have been into these deep levels of meditation or praying or chanting, they say that their profound spiritual experiences are far more real than what we experience day to day. That is, what we experience through our five senses. They say that this beats it. I mean, this is not real. What they feel in those states, or what they experience in those states, is more real than what they see here. This is very uniform, cutting across studies, across countries, across cultures, and across patterns and tests which have been used to evaluate these patients, the subjects. And the second thing is, they always say that there is, in deep levels, there is merging of self into everything. Now, when we ask what is everything, they are not able to describe. They say that there is no limit, there is no boundary. I merge into everything. There is a postulate for that. I'll tell you that in brief later. And the third important thing is, they are very serene, they are calm, and they have a very positive outlook on life after they have had these experiences. Objectively, when we assess the findings on these studies, we find that there are different changes in the parietal lobe, which I showed you. There is suppression or decrease in activity in the parietal lobes, which receive sensory input from the rest of the body. And especially so in the precuneus, which is one of the most important areas in the parietal lobe and the posterior superior parietal lobule. And there is an increase in frontal lobe activity, especially so when it is connected with verbal activity like chanting or repeated praying, or even when they mention, when they are silent chanting or praying, without talking out loud, it still lights up the frontal lobes. And it permanently strengthens circuits which reduce anxiety, depression, etc. Especially what they have found is areas like the amygdala, which are more prone to provoke violent emotions, are suppressed. And the other areas like the anterior cingulate, which promote calm behavior, that is the discerning part of the medial frontal lobe, they become more strengthened in their activity. Now, why this, one of the postulates of why a person loses the sense of self has been put up in many of these studies. What they say is, as we go deeper into levels of meditation, the sensory input from the rest of the body is closed. That is, we close our eyes, we forget the surroundings. Therefore, the input may go to some extent up to the thalamus, but from the thalamus, what goes to the parietal lobe gets blocked. So it's our parietal lobes which determine our sense of self and separates us as a person or as an individual from our surroundings. It differentiates between self and the surrounding. So when that differentiation is lost because the parietal lobe is suppressed, it's not active, then they feel that there is no sense of self and it merges with the rest of the surroundings. So this is the current scientific explanation for this feeling of merging, or what we in our early descriptions in our cultural earlier used to call the unitary state or the samadhi. A person goes into that level, deep down into meditation, they feel that I don't exist, I doesn't exist, it's all one. So that's probably one of the, this is the current scientific explanation for that. Now we have seen about all these spiritual practices. Can the same thing occur in an atheist, for example, or an agnostic? Can a person who doesn't believe can also be spiritual? Can these findings be replicated in people who do not believe in God, or say, no, I don't go to a temple, I don't do this, I don't follow practices? The answer is yes, it can, and they do. And certain intense situations like patriotism, courage can bring on similar changes. And when they practice repeatedly, like for example, competitive games, a person who is highly competitive, being in the zone, they forget everything else. They say that I was lost to the surrounding. I was so concentrated on my game. Like for example, basketball players or cricket players. For example, Bradman used to describe that when he was playing cricket, the reason for his success, he said it very simply. He said, it is because I see nothing else but the ball. And the ball, the cricket ball, even though so small, looks like a huge cricket ball to me. I don't see the spectators, I don't see the stadium, I don't even see the bowler. He was so focused and concentrated. The same thing was said of Arjuna. When he shot the arrow at the eye of the target, he was the only one who was able to do it because he was in the zone. He was totally focused. So even such activities, not necessarily religious, can promote similar findings. So what has been the response of our mainstream science to all this? Now that's very interesting. In the initial stages, it was all debunked. People said, oh, this is all nonsense. This is all the product of a diseased mind. All this cannot happen. Consciousness is only because of brain activity, period. Neuronal activity produces consciousness. Nothing else does. That's it. If the brain stops functioning, you are not conscious. When the brain is functioning, it is consciousness. So fine. Cause, effect, cause. So there's nothing else. So that's what they said. And then, but having said that, there is scientists are not able to prove why certain things occur. For example, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. People are not able to explain how such a thing happens. For example, out-of-body experiences for certain of our friends who are non-medical, non-neurological is that in certain situations, intense, it may be emotional situations or traumatic situations, or when the person is near death and then they are resuscitated. For example, a person has a heart attack, they almost pass out, and then they are resuscitated back to life with a shock and all that. Many of them come back, when they become awake, they describe they went to a different place, they were received by a very, it was a very, it's difficult to describe what they describe. They try to put it into words saying that it was a very warm, compassionate, loving, etc., etc. And they were received by beings who are made of light and so on, which they are not really able to describe. Now, when we ask or when we try to find out why or how such a thing happens, there are certain studies which have shown that the temporoparietal junction is the area which projects the self onto us. So they found that by stimulating or lesioning these parts, are you able to produce OBEs or out-of-body experiences? The answer is yes, they were able to do that. But then it was not as graphic or as complete as what these people describe. Now, for example, there is a case in which a lady almost died. She was being resuscitated. She had a heart attack. The physician was resuscitating. He had a very expensive golden pen in his pocket. It fell down and rolled under the bed, but this lady was not in her body. She said that she was floating near the ceiling and she saw the whole process, and suddenly she felt as if she was being pulled back into the body when the resuscitation was successful. And then the next day she found the physician searching for his pen, and she said, I saw it, it rolled under the bed. So, and really they were surprised. They looked under the bed, they found the pen. So how can we explain this anecdotal episode? What we do scientifically is we conveniently ignore all these things. We don't look at this. We say, oh, this was a one-off. We don't know. We can't really explain how this happened. But it has happened, and now there are large bodies of evidence which have studied near-death experiences in detail, and there is a huge compilation both in the form of books and scientific articles which are now available. People can go through them. I won't go into those details. Of course, again, there is a caveat here. There's no denying that some of these accounts are similar to religious delusions and mental illnesses like schizophrenic disorders. Patients with those are known to be hyper-religious. They have grandiose ideas. And especially this has been so with so-called mystics or people who call themselves mystics and misuse the category. But then a very interesting study was done by these two people, Jeffrey Savera and John Rabin, in 1997, and they defined the core elements of this so-called mystical experience. And you will find, again, emotion plays a very major role here. Strong contradictory emotions. During a mystical experience, person can experience fear and joy, or bliss, or ecstasy. No, they can't explain how.